the morning of April 4th, 1922, a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer walked a dirt path through rural Bavaria that he had walked hundreds of times before. It was a quiet morning, cold, the kind of cold that makes the air feel thick, like it's pressing against your face. He could see his breath in small clouds ahead of him. On either side of the path, snow-dusted fields stretched out flat and empty, and beyond them, a line of dark pine trees that marked the edge of the forest. He was heading to his neighbour's farm, a place called Hinterkaifeck. He had not seen the Gruber family in several days. That was strange. Not strange enough to alarm him, but strange enough that it had been sitting somewhere in the back of his mind, a small, persistent discomfort, like a pebble in a boot. He knocked on the front door of the farmhouse. No answer. He walked around to the barn, grabbed the heavy wooden door by its iron handle, and pulled it open. The smell reached him before his eyes adjusted to the dark. Something metallic. Something wrong. He took one step inside, then another. Then he stopped. And what Lorenz Schlittenbauer saw inside that barn on the morning of April 4th, 1922, is something that, by all accounts, he never fully recovered from. Not for the rest of his life. But here's the thing. The murders hadn't happened that morning. They hadn't happened the day before, or the day before that. The Gruber family had been dead for 4 days, and in all that time, someone had been living in the house with them. The Hinterkaifeck murders, Bavaria, Germany, 1922. About 6 months before Lorenz Schlittenbauer pulled open that barn door, the Gruber family's maid quit. Her name was Crescence Rieger, and she had worked at Hinterkaifeck for years. She knew the property well, the layout of the rooms, the sounds the old farmhouse made at night, the way the wind came off the forest and rattled the shutters. She knew all of it, but there was one sound she couldn't explain. Footsteps. From the attic. Not the settling of old beams, not animals. Footsteps. The deliberate, measured kind. The kind that paused when she paused, as if whatever was up there was also listening. She told Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, a 63-year-old farmer built like a man who had spent his whole life doing hard physical work, and Andreas waved her off. He went up to the attic and looked around. He found nothing. He told her she was imagining things. But Crescence didn't think she was imagining things. She left anyway, gave her notice and left. And Hinterkaifeck sat quiet through the winter with no maid, just the 6 people who lived there. Andreas and his 72-year-old wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, who was 35, Victoria's children, little Kazilia, who was 7, and the baby, Josef, who was 2 years old. 6 people on an isolated farm, half a mile from the nearest neighbour, ringed on 3 sides by forest. Then, in the weeks before the murders, things got stranger. In mid-March of 1922, Andreas found a newspaper sitting on the kitchen table. A paper from Munich. He stood there looking at it for a while, turning it over in his hands. He did not subscribe to this paper. He had not bought it. He asked everyone in the house. Nobody had brought it home. Then a set of his keys went missing from a hook by the door. And then, just days before everything ended, Andreas walked outside one morning and found footprints in the fresh snow. They came from the edge of the forest, and they led straight to the farmhouse, to a side door with a broken lock that opened into the machine room. Andreas stood there in the cold looking at these footprints for a long time. There were no footprints leading back out. That night, the Gruber family heard footsteps coming from the attic again. Andreas went up and found nothing. He mentioned all of this to a neighbour who offered to lend him a gun. Andreas said no. He didn't think that was necessary. 6 days later, he was dead. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, the new maid arrived. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was 44 years old, and this was her first day at Hinterkaifeck. Her sister had walked her there and stayed for a short visit before leaving in the late afternoon. That was the last time anyone outside the farm saw the Grubers alive. At some point that night, after dark, someone lured the family to the barn. No one knows exactly how. Maybe there was a sound from inside, an animal behaving strangely, something falling. Maybe someone called out. Maybe they were led there one by one on some small, ordinary pretense. What investigators eventually determined was this. Andreas went to the barn first, then his wife, Kazilia, then their daughter, Victoria, then 7-year-old Kazilia. Each one walked in. None of them walked out. The weapon was a mattock, a heavy farm tool with a broad, flat blade on one side and a sharp pick on the other. It was the kind of tool that would have been familiar in any barn in rural Bavaria, the kind of tool no one would look twice at. The killer used it on each of them in turn. And then, When the barn was quiet, they went into the house. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid who had been at Hinterkaifeck for less than a day, was killed in her bed. She likely never heard it coming. 2-year-old Josef was killed in his cot. The bodies were covered, straw pulled over them, sheets arranged with a kind of deliberate care that later made investigators deeply uncomfortable, like someone tidying up after themselves. And then something happened that has no good explanation. The killer stayed. For 4 days, while 6 bodies lay covered in hay inside that barn and in the house, someone lived at Hinterkaifeck. Neighbours later told police they had seen smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney. The livestock was fed. Someone had cooked meals in the kitchen. Someone had slept there, moved through the rooms, kept the fires going against the March cold. On April 1st, a Sunday, young Cecilia missed church. Victoria, who sang in the choir, wasn't there either. Neighbours thought it was strange but said nothing. On April 2nd and 3rd, Cecilia missed school. By April 4th, the mail had been piling up at the post office for days. Lorenz Schlittenbauer walked the path to Hinterkaifeck and pulled open the barn door. When the Munich police arrived, the closest department was nearly 45 miles away. They found a scene that had been disturbed by the time they got there. Neighbours, horrified and confused, had walked through the farmhouse. Someone had even cooked in the kitchen that day, apparently in a state of shock. By the time investigators began their work, the crime scene was compromised. What they could determine from autopsies and physical evidence was this. The elder Cecilia had been struck in the head 7 times, hard enough to crack her skull. Andreas's cheekbones had been driven through the skin of his face. Victoria had 9 separate wounds to the head, in a pattern the medical examiner described as star-shaped. The 7-year-old girl had clumps of her own hair tangled in her fingers, which meant she had been alive long enough after the attack to tear it out. More than 100 suspects were questioned over the years that followed. The case was examined, re-examined, handed between detectives, and eventually shelved as Germany collapsed into hyperinflation, and then into darker things entirely. No one was ever charged. The farmhouse was demolished in 1923. When workers tore it apart, they found the bloodied mattock hidden in the attic, where the footsteps had been heard. In 2007, a team of modern investigators announced they believed they had identified the most likely suspect. They declined to release the name, citing respect for surviving relatives. The land where Hinterkaifeck stood is empty now. A small stone memorial marks the site. And some people who have visited say that on a very still night, when the wind drops and the forest goes quiet, you can hear something. A sound from above. Measured. Deliberate. Like footsteps. The death of Elisa Lam. Los Angeles, California, 2013. On the evening of January 26, 2013, a 21-year-old college student named Elisa Lam checked into a hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She was from Vancouver, Canada. She was bright, curious, the kind of person who filled her blog with the names of bookstores she wanted to visit, and things she'd seen that day that made her think. She was in the middle of a solo trip down the California coast. San Diego first, then Los Angeles, then Santa Cruz. She posted photos from the San Diego Zoo just days earlier, and you can see from the pictures that she was having a good time. She carried a backpack. She had her laptop, her wallet, her ID. She called her parents every single day while she was traveling. The hotel she checked into was called the Cecil. If Elisa had researched the Cecil Hotel before booking her room, she might have chosen somewhere else. The Cecil had been built in 1924, during the golden era of Hollywood. It had a marble lobby and stained glass windows, and it catered to business travelers and tourists. But when the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, the neighborhood around it never recovered. The hotel sank with it, decade by decade, until it sat square in the middle of Skid Row, one of the most impoverished, crime-ridden blocks in one of the most impoverished, crime-ridden cities in America. By the time Elisa checked in, the Cecil had seen at least 18 confirmed deaths within its walls. Murders, suicides, overdoses. Serial killer Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, responsible for at least 13 murders across California, had lived at the Cecil in the 1980s, paying $14 a night for a room. Austrian serial killer Jack Unterweger had stayed there in 1991, allegedly murdering 3 women during his visit. The hotel's manager would later tell a documentary crew that in her 10 years working there, she counted approximately 80 deaths. But Elisa probably didn't know any of that. She dragged her bag through the lobby and found her room on the 5th floor. For the first 2 nights, things seemed fine. She called her parents. She explored the neighborhood. She posted to her blog. Then something shifted. On January 28th, 2 days into her stay, Elisa's roommates made a complaint to the front desk. They said she was behaving strangely. The hotel manager would later describe it as certain odd behaviour. Elisa had apparently been leaving notes on her roommates' beds that said things like, "Go home" and "Go away." She had been locking the door and demanding a password for entry. The hotel moved her to a private room. That same day, she attended a live taping of a television show in Burbank. She was escorted off the premises by security due to disruptive behaviour. These are the last things anyone outside the hotel confirmed about Elisa Lam's movements. On January 31st, 2013, Elisa Lam was last seen on a surveillance camera inside one of the Cecil Hotel's elevators. The footage is 2.5 minutes long. She steps into the elevator wearing a red hoodie and dark pants. She presses buttons, several of them, seemingly at random. The elevator doesn't move. The doors don't close. And then Elisa does something that nobody has been able to fully explain. She leans out into the hallway and looks both directions. Then she steps back inside. Then she steps back out. She presses herself flat against the inside wall of the elevator, as if trying to hide from something she can see in the hallway that the camera cannot. Then she steps back out into the hallway, and her arms begin to move. Not frantically, not like someone having a seizure. Slowly. Her hands and arms moving in a way that looks almost like she is talking, like she is having a conversation with someone who isn't there. She steps back into the elevator. She steps back out. And then she walks out of frame. The elevator doors, which had been open the entire time, finally close. That is the last footage ever taken of Elisa Lam alive. Her parents called the hotel the next day, then the day after that. When Elisa did not check out and could not be found, they reported her missing. The police searched the hotel. Dogs were brought through. Officers went room to room. They checked the roof. They found nothing. The LAPD released the elevator footage on February 13th, hoping someone would recognize her behavior or have information about her whereabouts. The video went viral within hours. Millions of people watched it, and the theories came fast, and they came from everywhere. That she had been under the influence of something, that someone had been stalking her through the hotel, that the Cecil itself had done something to her, that what she was doing in the elevator was something called the elevator game, an urban legend in which pressing buttons in a specific sequence was said to open a portal to another world. The investigation produced nothing. And then, on February 19th, 19 days after Elisa was last seen, hotel guests started complaining. The water pressure in their rooms was low. There was a strange smell coming from the taps. Someone said the water tasted wrong. A maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez climbed to the roof to check the 4 large water storage tanks that supplied the hotel. Each tank held roughly 1,000 gallons. He checked the first one, then the second. On the third tank, he noticed the hatch on top was open. He climbed the ladder on the side of the tank and looked inside. Elisa Lam's body was found floating in the water on February 19th, 2013. She was naked. Her clothes were floating nearby in the tank. There were no signs of physical trauma, no signs of assault, no wounds, nothing to immediately indicate how she had gotten there or what had happened to her. For 19 days, the guests of the Cecil Hotel had been drinking, bathing in, and brushing their teeth with the water from that tank. The coroner's office initially ruled the cause of death as undetermined. Months later, after toxicology results came back, they revised it to accidental drowning, with bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. Elisa had a history of bipolar disorder and had been off her medication. When she was found, the concentration of medication in her system was significantly lower than the number of pills remaining in her room suggested it should have been. Detectives and mental health experts who reviewed the case later said this: when someone with a severe bipolar condition stops taking their medication, they can enter states of acute psychosis, hallucinations, paranoia, episodes in which the person is entirely convinced they are being followed, watched, hunted. Episodes in which their own behaviour, observed from the outside, looks incomprehensible. This is the official explanation, but it doesn't answer everything. To reach the water tank on the roof of the Cecil Hotel, Elisa would have needed to either pass through a rooftop door that was kept locked and alarmed, an alarm that would have triggered if the door opened, or climb 3 stories up a fire escape on the exterior of the building. She would then have needed to climb a 10-foot ladder bolted to the outside of a steel tank. She would have needed to lift a heavy metal hatch, and then she would have needed to lower herself inside and close the lid above her. There is no record of the alarm being triggered that night. The hotel's rooftop access logs showed no activity. No one has been able to explain exactly how she got there. The case is officially closed. On the last blog post Elisa Lam published before she disappeared, she placed a quote at the top of the page. It was from the novelist Chuck Palahniuk. It read, "You're always haunted by the idea you're wasting your life. The Dyatlov Pass incident, Ural Mountains, Soviet Union, 1959. On the morning of January 27, 1959, a group of 10 young Soviet hikers boarded a truck in a small town at the edge of the Ural Mountains and headed north into the wilderness. They were students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, experienced outdoorsmen, every one of them. Their leader was a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, quiet, precise, the kind of person who planned things down to the last detail. He had organized this expedition himself, plotted every waypoint, calculated every food ration. The route they had chosen was classified as Category 3. In the Soviet Union at the time, that was the highest difficulty rating available. The temperature in the northern Urals in February could drop to -40 degrees. The winds could take the skin off your face. This was not a group of amateurs wandering into terrain they didn't understand. These people knew exactly what they were doing. One of them, a student named Yuri Yudin, turned back on January 28th with a flare-up of joint pain. He watched his 9 friends disappear into the tree line, and then he went home. He never saw any of them again. The group was expected back by February 12th. When they didn't arrive, nobody worried immediately. Expeditions like this ran late. Weather happened. But by February 20th, with still no word, a search party was dispatched. On February 26th, a student volunteer named Mikhail Sharavin was moving through the snow on the eastern slope of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kolats Yakul. The name, in the Mansi language, means dead mountain. He was scanning the landscape when something caught his eye. A corner of orange fabric, just barely visible above the surface of the snow. It was a tent. He got closer and saw that it was badly damaged. The fabric had been torn and slashed in several places, but the cuts had been made from the inside. Someone had used a knife to slice through the tent wall from within and then crawled out through the hole. Everything inside the tent was still there. Food, clothing, boots, warm coats, the hikers' diaries, cameras, a flask of vodka, a plate of pork fat left out as if someone had been about to eat dinner. All of it, abandoned. And leading away from the tent, down the slope and toward the tree line more than a kilometre away, were footprints. 9 sets of them. Some belonged to people wearing boots, some to people wearing a single boot. Some were made by socked feet. At least 2 sets were made by bare feet, in snow, in temperatures below -25 degrees Celsius. The first 2 bodies were found on February 27th, beneath a large cedar tree at the edge of the tree line, nearly a kilometre from the tent. Their names were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. They were in their underwear. At the base of the cedar tree were the remains of a small fire, which they had clearly tried to build. The branches above the tree had been broken at a height of about 15 feet, as if someone had climbed it, possibly to look at something, or possibly to get away from something on the ground. Their hands had been burned. Over the next several days, 3 more bodies were found between the cedar tree and the tent. Igor Dyatlov himself was found lying face up in the snow, mid-slope, facing back toward the tent, as if he had been trying to return to it. 2 others were found in similar positions, scattered along the hillside. All 3 appeared to have died of hypothermia. The search continued, and then the snow came and halted everything. In May of 1959, when the spring melt began, searchers went back into the mountain. 4 more bodies were found under nearly 4 meters of snow, in a ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree. These 4 had clearly survived longer than the others. They were dressed in additional clothing that had been cut from the bodies of those who were already dead. The medical examiner who examined these 4 found something that made the investigation take a very different turn. 2 of them had fractured ribs. Not surface injuries, not bruising or abrasions, the kind of deep internal damage that, in the medical examiner's words, was comparable to the force of a car crash. The skulls of 2 others showed similar fractures. The damage was massive, catastrophic, and yet there was almost no external bruising, no wounds on the skin, just the internal destruction, as if the force had come not from a blow, but from enormous, crushing pressure applied to the outside of the body. One of the 4, a woman named Ludmila Dubinina, was missing her tongue. Her eyes were also missing. The official Soviet investigation lasted 2 months. It concluded that the group had died from a, quote, compelling natural force. The case was closed. The files were classified, and for 30 years they stayed that way. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the files were released, except parts of them were missing. What researchers and investigators found in the remaining documents over the following decades only deepened the mystery. Clothing from several of the hikers tested positive for radioactivity, low levels but present. The lead investigator from 1959, a man named Lev Ivanov, gave an interview in 1990 in which he stated that during the original investigation, his team had reported seeing strange glowing spheres in the sky above the mountain at night. He said he had been ordered by senior officials to remove this from the official record. Another group of hikers, camped roughly 50 kilometers from Dyatlov's group on the same night, reported seeing orange orbs hovering over the Kolatsiakal ridge. Theories multiplied over the decades. An avalanche, but there was no avalanche debris, and the slope was not steep enough. A military weapons test, possible given the proximity to Soviet missile test corridors. The local Mansi people, on whose sacred land the group had camped. But the Mansi were interviewed extensively and no evidence tied them to the scene. Infrasound, low-frequency sound waves from the mountain topography causing mass psychological panic. A fight within the group. A secret weapon. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the investigation. They announced their conclusion quickly. An unusual type of avalanche, a slab of wind-packed snow, had struck the tent. This caused the group to cut their way out and flee in a panic. The internal injuries in the ravine were consistent with being hit by a slab of compressed snow, not a direct blow. Many experts accepted this, many did not. One geohazard specialist at Durham University, reviewing the avalanche theory, said something that has stayed with researchers. He said, "This doesn't explain why these people, after being hit by an avalanche, ran off without their clothes into the snow. For people to do that, they must have been terrified of something. Something made one of them go crazy." The mountain pass where the tent was found was renamed in Igor Dyatlov's memory, Dyatlov Pass. Yuri Yudin, the one who turned back on January 28th, lived until 2013. He spent much of his life trying to find out what had happened to his friends. He visited the pass many times. He gave interviews. He examined the evidence. He never found an answer that satisfied him. He said once, near the end of his life, that he wished he had stayed, that he thought about it every single day, that the not knowing was worse than any answer could have been. 3 stories. 6 dead hikers on a mountain that has no rational explanation. A young woman floating in a water tank in the hotel where serial killers slept. An entire family slaughtered in a barn while someone lived quietly in their home for 4 days afterward. There are things in this world that stay strange, no matter how hard you pull at them. A case that gets studied and restudied and written about and debated and still give you nothing back but more questions. Those are the ones that follow you.